This morning I am in New Haven, Connecticut, talking with Fred Richard Shapiro, who is the Associate Librarian for Collections and Access Services and Lecturer in Legal Research at Yale Law School's Lillian Goldman Law Library. Fred, it is our custom to begin these conversations by asking a little bit about you as a human being, in addition to being a colleague, if I dare use that terminology. Could you tell us a little bit about your life, not only today, but perhaps even when you were younger?
I grew up in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I had an unusual educational path, I guess. I went to college at MIT, originally intending to become an engineer. My father was an engineer. I decided quickly that I had no interest in engineering and majored in literature. Then I went to law school at Harvard. I was a very, very indifferent law student. I practiced law afterwards for a short time at a small firm. And then we'll talk later, I'm sure, about how I got into librarianship. I'm married with 2 children. I guess what's probably most distinctive about me is I have very strong scholarly interests, particularly in language and related things to that, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Well, you have
also
several award-winning and highly recognized in all the right sorts of places, publications, and we'll talk about it again in a few minutes, but that's one of the characteristics that frankly I don't see in too many of our colleagues, including myself, when I do these conversations. So it's a characteristic that you're very special in that sense, I think. Yeah. So you grew up in New York, in the city, I assume.
I lived on Long Island.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's sort of close by,
Close.
but some people say it's a world of difference in some ways. Yeah. Well, before we sort of begin talking about, your credentials and your career, could I ask if you have any particular hobbies or other special passions that outside of work these days?
Well, I think anyone that knows me knows that my main hobby is writing books and doing research. Other than that, I'm a fanatical baseball and football fan, so that's how I relax for the most part.
Well, you must have enjoyed, yesterday I was in a sports bar having lunch at the hotel, and they had, I think, every team that was currently playing in the NFL was on one or more screens, and people were, so you enjoy writing and watching in certain particular areas, and that's great. I know, sort of beginning to focus on you as a professional. You have the 3 degrees. You've mentioned the undergraduate work you did at MIT in the degree, which I assume, did you get it at MIT, the literature degree?
Yeah.
Okay. Then you went to Harvard for law school, but you have a 3rd degree. Could you tell us a little bit what that is and where you got it?
Well, when I was practicing law after getting my law degree, I did not enjoy that particularly, and my wife, who was a librarian, one day suggested to me, had I ever thought about the idea of being a law librarian, that there were people with law degrees that went into law librarianship, and I had never even thought about that for a moment, but it immediately made a lot of sense to me. I was at that time already very interested in research. So I enrolled at library school at Catholic University of America because I was living in DC at the time. And I've never looked back. I've enjoyed every moment of being a law librarian. While I was practicing, if I needed to go to a law library, I would go to American.
Well, hopefully we treated you decently.
Yes.
Never absolutely sure what goes on after I've gone home, but hopefully that was the case. So you went to library school at Catholic U, and you've mentioned that your wife played a role in sort of acquainting you with the fact that this was an opportunity you could consider with using your law degree in the library. And did anyone else play any kind of a role in that decision?
Well, after I started thinking about going to library school, I decided I should talk with a few law librarians to get advice. So I talked with Roger Jacobs, who was the Supreme Court librarian at that time.
Yeah.
And he was very helpful. And I talked with, I tried to talk with Morris Cohen. I had great difficulty. He was on sabbatical at that time. I had great difficulty connecting with him. But I did talk to him as well. But I think Roger Jacobs was the main person that I consulted with.
Roger was a super colleague, as was Morris, but in another way. Was Morris at Harvard at that time?
He was at Harvard.
Okay, because he later came here to Yale.
Yes, and I worked with him and got to know him a lot better after the initial difficulties in connecting.
Mm-hmm. He had started out, I think, before he went to Harvard, he was at Penn. That's where he was the director.
Yes, and at Buffalo also.
And Buffalo was the previous, yeah, that's right. Now, I have some notes that I made in preparation for today, and that you have had opportunities to work with some of the, I think, luminaries in our field in your early days especially, and I'm thinking of people, of course, like Morris at Harvard and Yale, Diana Vincent Davis, who was here at Yale, I think, at the time, Blair Kaufman, of course, who just recently retired and is now living in Maine, God's country, if there ever was one. Although for a guy that lives on the West Coast, that ocean's on the wrong side of the road up there, I've noticed. And even Roy Mirsky from the University of Texas. You have any comments or thoughts about what it was like to work with some of those people?
Yeah, I think I was privileged to work with some extraordinary directors. I started, after I graduated library school, I started job hunting, and I noticed after looking for a few months and not seeing too many things that were appealing, I noticed a huge ad in the Chronicle of Higher Education that listed about 10 jobs at New York Law School, and I noticed that it used the same language that I had seen in University of Texas listings.
You were going to be a lawyer, a librarian.
Right, and it turned out that Roy Mirsky, who was normally the director at Texas, was going to be a visiting director at New York Law School, and I think he wanted to make a big splash by advertising for 10 jobs. He didn't really want to fill 10 jobs, but so he was going to be in Washington, and I arranged to talk with him. And after I talked with him for 10 minutes, he said, "Fred, I'm in an unusual position where I could offer you jobs at two places, either the University of Texas or New York Law School. If you had to choose right now, which would you choose?" So I was kind of flummoxed, and I blurted out Texas. And then I went back and told my wife about this, and she said, "What are you talking about? We have no interest."
We're New Yorkers.
Neither of us have any interest in living in Texas. So I corrected myself, and I told Roy that I would prefer New York Law School, even though I didn't really want to go back to New York. I was a New Yorker, but I didn't really enjoy living in New York. But I did go to New York Law School, and it was an extraordinary experience. Roy had was pretty much written a blank check at New York Law School.
Yeah.
They gave him a fancy apartment. He had a personal driver.
We all heard about that.
Member. So we, just by being there at that time, I got to participate in things that no other library had been involved in. You know, I think of Roy as a mentor. I think I learned a lot from him, and particularly because Roy had such a grand vision of law librarianship. He felt the library was the core of any law school.
Mm-hmm.
That gave me a kind of a high standard to aim for in terms of thinking that law librarianship was something important, and that you could do a lot of things with a career as a law librarian.
Yeah. Sounds like that was sort of an ideal first position for you.
Well,
for all those reasons.
It was crazy in many ways,
Yeah.
but it was ideal, and Roy treated me very well. And he was not the easiest person to work for, but he treated me better than he did most of his employees.
Well, you know, the thing about Roy is he was rough and gruff. I remember visiting the University of Texas to have the Cook's tour. Roy had been on me to, come on down and see my new library, and I finally did. And one of our colleagues took me around, and everyone was very careful to always refer to Roy as Mr. Mirsky, even when he wasn't around. Because I think that just, that was the expectation, and they weren't going to cross swords with that man. Although it was funny, there's another story about him down there. When he was at New York U for that period of time, he would fly back and forth to Austin, and between Austin and New York, check in on the people at the other place. And now that Roy is no longer with us, I can tell this publicly, and he won't be able to figure out to do anything about it. But people at the airline that he flew would watch for him on the manifest of passengers, and somebody would alert the librarians down at in Tarleton, in the law library, that he was on his way.
Interesting.
So that everything would be shipshape and ready when he got there, and I don't think he ever had any inkling that there was a tip-off in advance. Not that it probably wasn't shipshape and as it should be anyhow, but they knew he was coming.
So I worked at New York Law School for 5 years. Became head of reference there, and then there was an opening at Yale for head of public services. The first head of public services there. I've never succeeded anyone at any of the jobs I had. I was always the first to hold a particular position, and so there was Morris Cohen, who was then at Yale, was creating for the first time a head of public services position. So I interviewed with him, and he ended up hiring me, and that was the biggest break I ever received in my life, other than meeting my wife, because Yale was really an ideal place for me to work, and Morris was my other mentor as a law librarian besides Roy, and he also gave me a model of a kind of grand vision of law librarianship. In his own way, he had high standards, and was a remarkable person, as everyone that knew him knows. And he had a vision of excellence and breadth. That his interests were extremely broad, and he saw librarianship as an intellectual profession, and that was congenial to me.
Well, for someone with your accomplishments now, in hindsight, he must have been, in some senses, like Roy in another sense, an absolute ideal mentor and leader in the library where you were working.
Yes, he was. He was. Morris was a traditional librarian. So that, I think, created some limits to his vision. Whereas I think I learned later, particularly in working for Blair Kaufman, that you could do a lot of things in law librarianship that were not traditional, that were bolder and more innovative than Morris, who was really a prince of the traditional model of librarian, but not as likely to think outside the box as Blair Kaufman was.
Yeah. I've always sort of perceived Morris as sort of akin to some of our predecessors back in the 1920s and 30s, like Fred Hicks here at Yale, Art Beardsley out at Seattle, and a few others, who were more scholars turned librarians than librarians, dabbling maybe in scholarship.
Yeah, I think that's a good description.
Yeah. Blair, of course, is a leader, as you say, was innovative and probably quite a change from Morris in terms of focus and ways of going about things.
Yes, and I wouldn't say that Blair was a mentor in the same way for me, because I was already 40 years old by the time.
You were pretty seasoned.
He came here, so I was pretty much formed at that point as a librarian, but Blair did give me a new kind of vision of someone very open to change, to doing things differently, and he really did extraordinary things here at Yale. I often say that, although I worked with the two leading law librarians, I would say, of the late 20th century, Morris and Roy, I would consider Blair to have been the greatest law librarian ever, probably.
Given the other two and who they were and how highly thought of.
Do you want me to elaborate on that?
Feel free to do so.
First of all, Blair's personality is exceptional. Where he is, I brought along something I had written about him to refer to. He's unusually forthright, unpretentious, upbeat, and informal. His management style is that he hires the best people and then kind of turns them loose and lets them come up with ideas and then supports those ideas fully. And because of that, he, together with his own managerial abilities and persuasive abilities, he was able to do things at Yale that I don't think have ever been done at other libraries, other law libraries. That he was able to get tremendous support from the law school. I think if you ask the dean of Yale Law School today, what's the part of the law school that is most appreciated by the students, and the faculty, what is the part of the law school that the dean gets the fewest complaints about, he would say the library. Blair was able to get support for tremendous projects here, a major renovation of the physical space, a massive reclassification and retrospective conversion project. This was all in the 1990s. But later he supported tremendously ideas that came out of my department in the library that I think have been very exceptional. And I don't take much credit for these things because I've been lucky to have wonderful librarians working for me in my department who have done unimaginably great things. in the access services area. Access services is not a big deal at most libraries, but here we've had all kinds of innovations like Therapy Dog. We were the first library to have a real therapy dog program. We have reached out to the students tremendously. The students now, in surveys, show that the students love the law library more than any other part of the law school. And a lot of that comes from access services. We check out soccer balls and umbrellas and all kinds of non-book things at the circulation desk. We've also we've done services such as scan on demand. We were one of the first to, without any charge to students, scan things that they wanted scanned. Another area where, in my department, that Blair was very, very supportive of is rare books. And Blair is not an antiquarian. He's not Morris Cohen.
Yeah.
I don't think he probably had much interaction with rare books before coming to Yale, but when he came to Yale, and then when we hired Mike Widener as our rare book librarian, who is easily the premier rare law book librarian in the country, there was a great combination of Blair and Mike Widener and myself. I had a strong interest in rare books. And we, even though Blair was not an antiquarian, he fully supported Mike's ideas and my ideas about rare books. And we did unbelievable things, such as we acquired the Towson collection, which was the world's leading private collection of English law books. And I thought that was impossible. When Mike Widener first started talking to me about it, I said, Mike, forget it. You know, this is going to cost millions of dollars. We cannot afford that. And Mike said, well, you know, let's see. And, you know, with Blair's help, we were able to come up with a way to get that collection, which I had thought was impossible. And it did not cost the law library very much money. We got other people to supply the money for us. We did all kinds of new kinds of rare book collecting. We became the repository for the Supreme Court bobblehead collection, for example.
Oh, yeah.
So that's
So you have all the justices around here someplace.
right. So that's a creative form of rare books. We acquired, and this was Blair's baby. We acquired a major part of the rare book collection of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, which was looking
for a new home
get rid of their
it, yeah.
rare books. And then something that was my initiative, which Blair fully supported, was that we've done huge projects of digitizing rare books, working with the Gale Company. We created the Making Modern Law project, which had digitized tens of thousands of law books, monographs, and I was the consultant for that project and planned and implemented the great part of it. So these are just examples of the kind of vision Blair had, and I think this was ideal for me, the kind of support that Blair gave for these initiatives. And that's just my department. Other parts of the library, he also did fantastic things and fully supported them.
I remember I was here as the assistant librarian for 2 years back in the early 70s, and we had an old safe vault down in the technical services area, and the rare books such as we had then were pretty much all in there. No climate control, no real security. I mean, the door was open all the time to the thing. But I remember the Blackstone collection, which is now you have processed and it's been digitalized, and now it's accessible to all of us.
Yes, I remember that vault, but we now have a beautiful rare book room, which was part of the renovation that Blair spearheaded, and we have built up our rare book collection quite a bit. We will never match Harvard's rare book collection or even come close to it. They have their collection for law rare books is probably better than any collection any library has for any subject. But I think we're now clearly the major rare law book collection other than Harvard and the Library of Congress.
Yeah. Well, I imagine this room has all the right controls and climate and fire suppression, everything else you would want. I've noticed coming into the building after all these years that you also, Blair or someone can take credit, or you can, you have air conditioning now, which we did not have in this building.
Yes, and I was here in the pre-air conditioned era.
Oh, that was right in the summer.
Miserable in the summer.
Yeah.
So that was Blair that did that as part of the renovation in the 1990s.
Yeah, well, it makes quite a difference, especially on it's muggy out there, and we're having rain today, and because this is early September still.
Yeah, in this summer I don't want to take my vacation. I want to be here to be in the air conditioner.
Oh, well, you go out and wherever you go, maybe you don't have air conditioning.
Right. I don't
You have
a
to
lot of
pick
air
your
conditioning
places.
at home.
Go up into northern Maine or out west far enough or something.
Yeah.
But maybe that's
No,
not your
I should
inclination anyhow.
do that. I should do that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds, Fred, like you've had an interesting time here. You've been here actually just short of 30 years now. You came in 1987.
Yeah.
So you've had a major career here at Yale by itself. But you haven't just been a do my regular work type of guy. You are a very accomplished and prolific author of some rather interesting kinds of things too. And I'm thinking of things like your Yale Book of Quotations, which is now, I understand, you have a second edition in press or coming, or maybe it's published.
I'm working on it. I can tell the story of how I got involved in that kind of thing. I mentioned before that I was a very, very indifferent law student at Harvard. So basically I set records for cutting classes that will never be equaled at Harvard. And what I did instead of my law studies was I hung out at Widener Library, the main library at Harvard, and I became interested in. They had a great collection of books on sports and games in the basement, and I found that there was one word I was looking. Well, one game I was interested in that tiddlywinks. It was actually, and I found that I happened to look in a dictionary called the Oxford English Dictionary, and I looked up the word tiddlywinks, and they indicated that the earliest use that they knew of for the word tiddlywinks, the game tiddlywinks, was 1894. But I found in these old books at Widener Library an 1890 Encyclopedia of Sports and Games that had an entry for tiddlywinks. I thought the OED was perfect, and I didn't understand how I could have found something earlier than them, but a friend of mine said, well, they're compiling a supplement. Why don't you write them? They would be interested in this earlier usage. So I wrote to them, and I found I could do this kind of antedating for other words connected with sports and games, and then I branched out into many other fields like law, social sciences, American slang, popular culture, and I found that, so I really became very interested in improving on the datings of words in the Oxford English Dictionary, and I became actually their most major contributor. This was I had less time for this after I started working as a librarian, but I have continued up to this day. And I got the idea that I could, well, what happened was I had, later I had lunch with an editor from Oxford University Press, and he said, well, I can see, Fred, that you're very interested in reference works. Is there some legal reference work that you think there's an opening for, and that you might be interested in doing? And I said, well, there's no good legal quotation dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up compiling the Oxford Dictionary of American Legal Quotations.
Mm-hmm.
And I used the same kinds of techniques that the Oxford English Dictionary uses to research the origins of quotations.
Mm-hmm.
And so after I published that, I then got the idea of doing a general quotation dictionary, something that would be better than Bartlett's quotations or the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, and using the same kinds of research techniques and novel research techniques of online searching. I compiled the Yale Book of Quotations, which came out in 2006, and that so that was my major book. I've published a number of other books, but that was the big one, and as you say, I'm now working on a second edition of it. And my training as a law librarian has been very relevant to these kinds of reference works I've done. And the online searching that I was familiar with from Lexis and Westlaw, I was able to use to really revolutionize our knowledge of the origins of quotations.
Mm-hmm. That must have been interesting to get into at the very beginning, and as the computerized systems became more robust and more available, it would expand your repertoire of sources quite a bit.
Yeah, I was very lucky that just at the time I was compiling the Yale Book of Quotations, there was an explosion of historical text collections that I could search that allowed me to find information that would have taken a lifetime to do 10 quotations back in the day, but now in a few minutes I can get great and new information about quotation origins.
Well, you've been recognized for some of this work, certainly by our association, ALL. In 1994, you were the recipient of the Joseph L. Andrews Bibliographical Award, which is, for those of our viewers who may not be aware of it, is our highest honor for work of publications of various sorts. And you also are, I think, the only two-time winner of ALL's Call for Papers competition, having received that in the years 1985 and 1987.
Actually, there have been a few other two-time winners.
You've also been mentioned favorably in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and even papers more diverse than that, such as the Times of London, some of your work. And those are interesting and recognitions in their own right, I'm sure. Probably very satisfying.
I have a real talent at getting the New York Times to cover my activities, and they've mentioned me over 100 times now. And they've through my activities mostly, our library has been mentioned, I think, 13 times in the New York Times. There have been articles about our bobblehead collection, and then many other, our therapy dog, many other articles about the Yale Law Library have appeared in the Times.
Well, you know, I had occasion, I was early this morning for our sessions, and the attendant downstairs at the main entrance let me roam the building, especially when I had told him I had been here. He seemed quite elated about that. He said in those days he was still a beat cop out here in the New Haven Police. But he let me wander around. I went through the reading room, and I noticed in one corner several shelves of board games, like Game of Thrones and some of the others. And then all these DVDs of various movies. You know, you could be masquerading as an older style one of those video stores we used to go to before everyone could sort of load it through the internet now and watch the movie that way. You have a number of collections, and I saw the Oxford English Dictionary and some supplements in another alcove off the room, and it was interesting. In my day, the shelves in there, one, didn't look as nice as they do today, but they also housed things like the way the English reports in one area, and the National Reporter System strung around the room, and now you have regular sorts of treatises and other things on the shelf. It's a different type of collection, as I guess is the norm now with digitalized versions of the reporters and so on.
Well, I think particularly at Yale, where the students and faculty are very social. They're really social scientists more than they are students of law. That we do give a great emphasis in our collection development to monographs rather than to the traditional serials that you see in the typical reading of a law library.
I remember even 40-some years ago, that was one of the huge strengths of this collection, and one that differentiated it from almost any place else, if not every place else, in that the breadth of the collection went well beyond the sort of standard fare of a law library, even an immense one like Harvard or the Library of Congress. Into all these interdisciplinary approaches. The faculty were into it, students in those days, and the library, of course, reflected it then, and that I gather has continued or perhaps even expanded over the years.
Yes, and as you say, the legal serials are used almost exclusively online now, so the things that are more important to collect in print are the monographs and foreign legal materials and rare books, and that's what we've done.
Yeah. Well, that'll give the collection breadth in a different way, and probably in some ways a little more permanence of those books too, because a lot of the things that can be obtained digitally, the economics of it, just the space needed to store them and house them, sort of dictates that a lot of libraries weed those now and rely only on the digital, except for those things that are needed that can't be obtained that way.
Right, and we've saved over $1 million per year by canceling print serials. Arthur Bonfield, who was a graduate of Yale Law School and as a faculty member oversaw the University of Iowa Law Library, he visited here a few years ago and talked with Blair and I, and when he found out that we had canceled the Federal Reporter and the Federal Supplement and the National Reporter System in print, I thought his head was going to explode because he was still operating from a traditional model where those were the most basic things. But by cutting those print subscriptions, we were able to afford virtually any monograph that we want, any electronic resource that we want, and a lot of rare books and foreign materials.
Yeah. We were driven in my last years at American U by lack of capacity for books. I mean, we were pretty full. And Hein Online had just started with the periodicals project, as they call it. And we were able to remove from the shelves a lot of law journals and so on. I think we sent them to the consortium of the Washington Research Library Consortium repository out east of DC, but because we weren't quite prepared to totally throw them out, but I think later my successor was a lot more ambitious in terms of weeding things that were obtainable elsewhere. And the students, the old standing joke I keep hearing is that the student is sitting there on a table with a whole wall of books behind him or her, looking at a screen, and the punchline is what that student wants is not on that screen. The student doesn't know it even exists, even with all these books in the room behind them.
Yes, that's the reality nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you've been able to do some fascinating and very innovative sorts of things in addition to just collecting in a broad scope of topics and subjects, disciplines.
Well, this is another attribute of Blair Kaufman, is that he believed that we should have the best print resources and the best digital resources. And he was always supportive of traditional collecting as well as newer media. And that I think was a great contribution of his.
Mm-hmm. Well, you too have made contributions. You've already alluded to some of your consulting work and the participation in some of the projects ongoing, and of course helping the authors or the compilers of some very prestigious and supposedly authoritative works sort of improve their product with a little better information. You want to talk any more about some of that kind of thing you've done, or professional outside work?
I've done consulting. I already mentioned that I've consulted with the Gale company on the making modern law products. And I've consulted with other legal publishers. I have to look at my CV to remember things that I've done. I've consulted with Yale University Press on reference publishing, and worked with them as part of my regular job in publishing a book series, the Yale Law Library series on legal history and reference, published by Yale University Press, but we work closely with them and often publish books by our own faculty, which helps cement our relations with the faculty.
Yeah. To say nothing is serving the greater need of a lot of people who probably find that information extremely helpful.
And I've worked with publishers in other ways, or done things that have ended up benefiting publishers. I think in some way I kind of saved the West Publishing Company. That's an overstatement, but when Lexis came out with when Lexis bought Shepard's, and Shepard's was pulled off of the Westlaw platform, that was probably the last time when the West Company's leadership in legal publishing was challenged. But I did a study at that time where I compared Keysight, which was the new citator that the West Company came up with to compete with Shepard's. I compared that with Shepard's and found that Keysight actually was more up to date and more thorough in its citator coverage than Shepard. So that I think played a major role in getting acceptance for Keysight, and it happened. It wasn't my purpose to save the West Publishing Company, but I think it ended up happening to some extent. So that's I feel I've made contributions to legal publishing in a number of ways.
Yeah. Well, Keysight has basically come into its own, but as you say, it began, or certainly came along at a time which was potentially high risk to the Reuters Thompson group that now basically is what West is called. had been owned by Thompson Publishing for a while. And the whole system of legal publishing was, should we say, changing, to put it the very least, with the acquisition of company after company by one or the other, a handful of huge operators, Lexus being one, Thompson being another. So times were changing. I mean, in the old days, you had kind of the arrangement where the products all sort of worked together nicely, but that was now, and you always had everybody's products and they connected, but that was changing. And you're right. Speaking of changes, I'm sort of hesitant to ask this because I know it's been a rather hot debate in our association in the last year or so, and may continue, who knows. But there have been those who say that we as librarians are antiquated, and the perception the public has is that we are something of the 19th century level in the 20th. And as the books start to sort of vanish from more and more law libraries, and you know, Yale is an exception. You have real books here and lots of them, but they're not necessarily the same ones you would have had on the shelves in 1935. So the issue has been whether we should rethink our branding. I think that's the term that's been used, and you have been articulate in suggesting that that may not be the right approach. Do you have any, you want to share anything about that?
Well, I have not been very active in AALL. I mean, my contributions have been in serving the Yale Law Library and serving the profession as a scholar and writer and consultant. But I think the one contribution that I made to ALL is one that I'm very proud of, which is that I think I led the charge against the recent proposal to change the name of ALL to the Association for Legal Information. And that happened, there was controversy about that, and I saw about that proposal, and I saw that Mike Chiarazzi, something he had written in which he pointed out a number of problems with the name change proposal, such as the fact that the initials ALI were already taken by a major legal organization. So I wrote a posting which I sent to the Law Live listserv and every other listserv I could possibly send it to reach law librarians, in which I kind of compiled all the arguments against the name change proposal. And I think at that point the AAL leadership assumed that there was no controversy, that the name change would pass.
Well, I think they were hearing from a constituency, primarily in the private sector, who perceived it as good for them.
I don't know where they were hearing it from, but I think they assumed that there was no opposition. What I found with my postings is that there was enormous opposition, and not all from academics. Most of the emails that I received, hundreds of emails supporting my position, and people posted to the same listservs their support, and most of it was from law firm librarians. It was not something that only academics felt strongly about. So the end result was that over 80% of the voters had no interest in a name change.
86 turned it down.
So I don't want to get too controversial here, but I hope that the AAL leadership now and in the future learns a lesson from that. That they shouldn't only listen to their consultants, but they should also listen to the membership. And it was a poor choice of name. It's very vague, and legal information can mean all kinds of things. It could mean lawyers providing legal advice or others providing legal advice to the public, it was not at all clear what it identified.
I think they were trying to paint with a broad brush because there was some concern that if we, as an association, were perceived too narrowly, that perhaps membership in the long term would suffer in a way that was not
Right, I think
good.
that was clearly a concern, but
Fred, we're sort of nearing the end of today's conversation, but it's my custom to ask if there's anything that we've not talked about that you would like to bring up.
I think we've covered the main points.
Certainly had a...
I just want to say that reiterate that I've had a wonderful career, and working in particular at Yale has been a great privilege, and I've worked with wonderful librarians here, and I mentioned Mike Widener. There's also Julian Aiken, who's the person behind a lot of the access services innovations that I mentioned, and many other fine colleagues here, and just the students and faculty at Yale are great to work with.
That is really, truly an accomplishment, because many libraries, especially in this era, I think have trouble being perceived as how to stay relevant with the students. I mean, they're all reading the stuff wherever they are on their computers. But it sounds like you people have ways of drawing them in and exciting them in ways that are good.
Right, I think nowadays many law libraries are in decline, that they're cutting, they're having their budgets cut, they're having their space taken away. That's not our problem here. If anything, our problem is that we're too successful, and we have trouble keeping up with all the expectations sometimes that our patrons have. But it's a good problem to have. And I should mention, our current director, Teresa Miguel Stearns, is I have every expectation that she is going to join the other great law librarians I've worked for and make her mark, and she already, in a short time, is doing some tremendous things that will help to keep us relevant and keep us central to the life of our law school.
I had the pleasure of having one of these conversations with Teresa earlier this morning, and I think at the end I commented, I think it's on camera, so it might be in the final video, that she's got a very hard act to follow, and both Morris and then more recently Blair, but hopefully, as you say, she's the right third act to that group. As you know, you and the others have certainly contributed mightily to the success Blair had as director. We all know the one person at the top can be made or broken by what the people in the ranks below them do. And it's a good operation from all I can tell.
When the search committee was appointed to find Blair's successor, that the day after they were appointed, I had lunch, arranged to have lunch with the chair of the search committee, and I told him, I said, you don't have to look far. The best person in the country for this job is right here, Teresa Miguel Stearns. Mm-hmm. And he already was familiar with her, and he agreed. And that I think it was a wonderful choice, and we'll look back in the future at Teresa as one of the great law librarians.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sure when the word got around that Blair was going to retire, there were a number of our colleagues out there and wherever who would perceive really to their liking to become appointed as his successor here at a place of this stature and reputation.
And I think it's clearly the plum job in all of law librarianship. For one thing, it has faculty status. Teresa, like Blair and like Morris, is a professor of law with tenure, and you don't see that at hardly any of the other big schools anymore.
Well, Morris actually got that, as he would be the one that,
Yeah.
type person that they would want to give it to, but his predecessors, immediate predecessors were not
Right.
in the tenure track or the
Yeah.
regular faculty lines.
Although going
They
further
had-
back, you had people like Frederick Hicks.
Yeah, he was
Samuel
fully
Fuller.
every bit a professor as well as a librarian. But there was a period sort of after Fred, I don't know just where, but I know my boss, Art Charpentier, had come from outside of the academy. He came from the Association of the Bar, the city of New York, and he told me privately at one point that he made a mistake not insisting on being a regular faculty member. They accorded him the stature of lecturer of law, but he said, I just did not understand how important that was for a variety of reasons. And he taught actually a little bit here. He taught
I think he was
research and writing.
associate dean.
He was the associate dean, actually, in the period for our readers that weren't part of this in the late '60s, with the war in Vietnam becoming very unpopular, impact of the civil rights legislation of the '60s and other things. It was a period of a lot of unrest on campuses, and Art was, at that time, it was sort of had just passed, but he was credited by many in the law school as having kept the lid on this place and prevented any major damage to the physical plant or its contents. He's the only boss I ever had who had a power megaphone in his closet on the floor. And he didn't use it at that point, but he had used it during that period to help calm things down, apparently.
And this, as an example, one more example of how Yale is a unique kind of place. The period you're talking about, which included a fire being set in the basement of the law library, played a decisive influence on Hillary Clinton's evolution, and that she, like other liberal law students, she had to choose between supporting the radical undergraduates of the time and protecting the law school from literally attack, and she chose to protect the law school. So that's a nice thing about Yale, is that any of our students could become President of the United States or a Supreme Court Justice.
Yeah. Well, maybe on that, Fred Shapiro, I should thank you for being part of our history, talking to me today, taking the time and effort to do so, and sort of squire me around and act as a host and all the other things one does. And I show up like I did today. And in thanking you, I'm thanking you not only on my own behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and of course our colleague also Dick Spinelli, the Hine Company, with whom I have the honor of working to put together this oral history of those of us in law librarianship, and both about us and about what we did during our era. Thank you.
I'm honored to be included, and thank you for taking the time to do these interviews.
Thank you.